Hi, my name is Henry, and this is Human Disaster. I want you to imagine this. A soft drink company runs a bottle cap lottery. Millions of ordinary people check their caps one morning and discover they have each won 1 million pesos. The only problem is the company has absolutely no intention of paying. What follows is not a polite legal dispute. What follows is grenades, riots, burning trucks, and one of the most chaotic corporate disasters in modern history. And it all started with a single, catastrophic number, 349. The Philippines in the early 90s, setting the stage. To understand why this story unfolded the way it did, you have to understand where it happened and when it happened. Context, as I have learned from years of researching these kinds of stories, is everything. Strip away the context, and you just have a company that made a printing error. Keep the context in, and suddenly the whole thing transforms into something far more human, far more devastating, and honestly, far more infuriating. I have been sitting on this story for 6 months because I wanted to make sure I got every detail right before sharing it with you. The more I read, the more I understood that this was not really a story about a lottery at all. It was a story about poverty and hope, and what happens when a corporation treats ordinary people like a rounding error. The country was rebuilding itself. The Marcos dictatorship had collapsed just a few years earlier. President Corazon Aquino had guided the nation through a shaky democratic transition, and by the time Fidel Ramos took office in 1992, there was cautious optimism in the air. But optimism does not pay the rent. The country was still deeply, structurally poor. The gap between the wealthy elite in Manila's walled villages and the millions living in informal settlements just beyond those walls was vast, and in many ways growing. For most Filipino families at that time, 1 million pesos was not just a large sum of money. It was a life-altering generational shift. It was the difference between a concrete house and a tin roof. It was school fees for every child in the family, paid for years into the future. It was the ability to say, for the first time, that you were no longer afraid of what next month would bring. When people talk about what 1 million pesos meant to the average Filipino in 1992, I do not think the full weight of that number is always appreciated outside the Philippines. That failure of imagination is part of why the outside world was so baffled by what happened next. So hold that image. Hold the image of a family in Manila, or Cebu, or Davao, living carefully, counting their pesos, dreaming quietly, and now introduce them to a bottle cap. The Cola Wars come to Manila. Here's something I find genuinely fascinating, and honestly, this detail is what made me fall in love with this story in the first place. The whole catastrophe didn't begin with negligence or greed, at least not in the obvious sense. It began with desperation, corporate desperation specifically. And there is something almost poetic about that. By the late 1980s, the global cola wars between Pepsi and Coca-Cola had been raging for decades. In most Western markets, the two giants had carved out fairly stable territories. But in the Philippines, the battle was fierce, personal, and deeply financial. Coca-Cola had an iron grip on the market. Pepsi was losing, and losing badly. Surveys from the period suggested Coca-Cola commanded somewhere in the region of 75% of the Filipino soft drink market. Pepsi was an afterthought on most store shelves, the cola you bought when the other one was sold out. For Pepsi's Philippine operation, this was an existential problem. You cannot sustain a business long-term on 25% of a market when your competitor has 3 times your share and an entrenched cultural presence. Something dramatic had to be done. Something bold, something that would cut through the noise and make Filipino consumers choose Pepsi not out of resignation, but out of excitement. And so the idea was born. A promotional campaign unlike anything the Philippine market had seen before. A campaign so ambitious, so brilliantly simple in its appeal that it would either rescue Pepsi's fortunes entirely or blow up in their faces in spectacular fashion. As it turned out, it would somehow manage to do both at the same time, which, I'll be honest, I find darkly hilarious in a way I probably shouldn't. The campaign had a name. They called it Number Fever. Number Fever is born. I'll be honest, when I first read about Number Fever, I was convinced it could not possibly be true. I had to go verify it myself because the sheer scale of it, the ambition of it, genuinely does not sound like something a real corporation approved in a boardroom meeting. It sounds like something someone dreamed up after one too many drinks, and then, somehow, nobody stopped them. Here is how it worked. Every bottle of Pepsi, 7-Up, and Mountain Dew sold in the Philippines came with a bottle cap. Printed on the inside of that cap was a 3-digit number. Every day, Pepsi would hold a drawing and announce a winning number on television and radio. If your cap matched the winning number, you won a prize. Simple, elegant, utterly brilliant in its reach. But what made Number Fever genuinely different from a standard competition was the prize structure. The top prize was 1 million pesos, not for one winner, not selected from a pool of correct entries. If your cap had the winning number, you won 1 million pesos. Full stop. Given the number of bottles sold daily across the Philippines, the theoretical exposure for Pepsi was staggering, which is precisely why the campaign required meticulous management of which numbers appeared on which caps. Non-winning numbers were supposed to be printed in enormous quantities. Winning numbers were supposed to be extraordinarily rare, and for a while, it worked beautifully. Sales figures for Pepsi rocketed. Filipinos who had never particularly cared about which cola they bought were now specifically requesting Pepsi because every bottle was a possible lottery ticket. Sorry stores, the small neighborhood convenience stalls that dot every Filipino street corner, could barely keep up with demand. Children were collecting caps. Families were comparing numbers over dinner. Number Fever was not just a marketing campaign. It had become a national pastime. I have shown this concept to friends who had zero interest in Filipino history, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing when I explained Number Fever, because it is just such a pure, perfect idea. Give ordinary people a daily reason to feel lucky. Give them something to check, something to hope for, something to talk about, and tie it to your product. It was, right up until the moment it catastrophically was not, a masterpiece of marketing. The number that should never have been drawn. This is the part where every single time I tell this story, I get goosebumps, and I have told it probably 100 times, because this is where a small, mundane technical failure becomes something enormous, and this is where the story turns. I printed out over 200 pages of research for this one story. My desk looked like a crime scene investigation board. The single most important thing I found in all of that research was this: the disaster that followed was not caused by malice. It was caused by a mistake so ordinary, so unremarkable in isolation, that it could have happened anywhere, in any industry, at any company. And that is what makes it truly terrifying. Pepsi had contracted an outside company to manage the printing and distribution of the bottle caps. The mechanics of the campaign required careful coordination between Pepsi's promotional team and the contractor. Certain numbers were designated as winning numbers, printed in tiny quantities, assigned specific prize values, and registered in a database. All other numbers were non-winning, printed in massive volumes, and assigned no prize whatsoever. The number 349 was one of those non-winning numbers. It was printed on approximately 800,000 bottle caps across the Philippines. 800. Let that settle for a moment. Now separately, the daily draw was operated by a security firm, DG Consultores, which used a randomization system to select each day's winning number. The way the system was supposed to work, there was a safeguard. When a number was drawn, it would be cross-referenced against the database of valid winning numbers before being announced. Non-winning numbers, like 349, were supposed to be filtered out automatically. If a non-winning number was drawn, the system was supposed to simply draw again. On the evening of May 25, 1992, the draw took place as usual, and the number that came out was 349. Somewhere in the process, something failed. Whether the cross-reference check malfunctioned, whether the safeguard was bypassed, whether there was a data entry error that caused 349 to appear in the system as a valid winning number. This has never been fully, conclusively established to everyone's satisfaction. What is established beyond any doubt is the outcome. 349 was announced on Philippine television and radio as the winning number for May 25, 1992. The prize was 1 million pesos. Most people gloss over this part, but I think it is secretly the whole point of everything. It was not a big dramatic failure. It was not sabotage or fraud. It was a quiet, unremarkable slip in a process that should have been foolproof. And because it happened quietly, nobody caught it in time. The morning, everything changed. I actually called my mom after learning this part of the story. She once thought she'd won a small competition only to be told she hadn't, and she described the feeling as a kind of grief. Now multiply that by hundreds of thousands of people and replace the small prize with 1 million pesos. The morning of May 26, 1992, started ordinarily enough. People woke up, made coffee, went about their routines, and then, one by one, and then in waves, they checked their bottle caps. 349, 349, 349. From Manila to Mindanao, across every neighborhood rich and poor, people found that number staring back at them. The television had said it. The radio had confirmed it. 349 wins, 1 million pesos. The debt was gone. The house was possible. The children were staying in school. This was the moment everything changed. Now, picture Pepsi's offices that same morning, because somebody at some point realized 800,000 caps, 1 million pesos each. The theoretical liability was 800 billion pesos, many times larger than Pepsi's entire Philippine revenue, larger than the national budget itself. An impossible, catastrophic, stomach-dropping number. Pepsi moved quickly. 349, the company announced, was a non-winning number. The draw was invalid. As a gesture of goodwill, each cap holder would receive 500 pesos. 500 pesos. Not 1 million, 500. There is something about this I genuinely struggle to put into words. 500 pesos wasn't nothing. But to a family who had already, in their minds, paid off every debt and fixed the roof and breathed out for the first time in years, it wasn't a consolation either. It was a door being slammed shut, and the Philippines was about to make sure Pepsi heard it. Pepsi's response, and why it made everything worse. This is one of those things I find myself randomly thinking about at 2 in the morning, because the question of how Pepsi should have handled this is genuinely fascinating, and I'm not sure there was a good answer, but I am fairly sure that what they actually did was one of the worst possible options available to them. The offer of 500 pesos as a consolation payment came from a place of corporate logic. That is, if you squint at it from the right angle, almost understandable. Pepsi did not, after all, intend to create a valid winning draw. The number 349 was never supposed to be drawn. No contract had been entered into with the holders of those caps. There was no legal obligation, Pepsi's lawyers would have argued, to pay out prizes on a number that was, by the company's own records, designated as non-winning. And the 500 peso offer was not nothing. It represented Pepsi acknowledging a mistake and attempting to make some restitution. Some cap holders did accept it. Some felt it was better than nothing. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that any competent communications professional should have seen coming from a mile away. You cannot offer someone 1 million pesos on a Tuesday night and then offer them 500 pesos on a Wednesday morning and expect them to say fair enough. The gap between those two numbers is not just financial. It is psychological. It is the gap between a changed life and an unchanged one. And when you close that gap by taking the changed life away, people do not respond with quiet disappointment. They respond with fury. The messaging from Pepsi made things worse still. The company was slow, corporate, defensive. There were statements about technical errors and invalid draws and designated non-winning numbers, all of which was accurate, all of which sounded to a family in a Manila neighborhood who had told their children they were getting a better life, like the cold language of an institution protecting itself at the expense of the people it had wronged. I spent 3 hours one evening trying to find any evidence that Pepsi had considered a more generous middle ground, a larger consolation figure, a goodwill gesture, commensurate with the scale of the disruption they had caused. I could not find any evidence that they seriously entertained one. That absence, I think, is the detail that unlocked everything that came next. A nation erupts. This is the kind of thing that, once you see it, completely changes how you understood everything that came before it. If you read about what happened next, you might be tempted to describe it as irrational. You might say that people had no legal right to the prize. You might say that Pepsi had made a mistake and offered a consolation in good faith. You might say the violence that followed was disproportionate. But if you have been paying attention to everything that came before, the poverty, the hope, the 1 million pesos that briefly lit up a morning before being extinguished, the cold corporate language of the response, then the eruption that followed, does not feel irrational at all. It feels, in a horrible and entirely human way, inevitable. Within days of the Pepsi's announcement, protests began outside Pepsi bottling plants and distribution centers across the Philippines. These were not small demonstrations. They were large, they were angry, and they escalated rapidly. Pepsi trucks making deliveries were attacked. Plant windows were smashed. In several incidents, Molotov cocktails were thrown at Pepsi vehicles and facilities. And then, in a detail that makes this story genuinely unlike any other corporate disaster I have ever researched, there were grenades. People threw grenades at Pepsi trucks. Security guards were injured. At least one woman was killed when a grenade was thrown at a Pepsi truck near a Manila bottling plant. Several more people died in incidents connected to the unrest. Dozens were injured. I went down such a deep rabbit hole on this that my wife had to physically take my laptop away from me at midnight because I kept finding new incidents, new locations, new faces behind the chaos. The violence was not confined to one city or one moment. It spread. Pepsi offices received bomb threats. Drivers refused to make deliveries in certain areas. The company, which had launched Number Fever to win a market, found itself in a situation where operating in that market at all had become dangerous. There were lawsuits too, enormous numbers of lawsuits. But the violence came first, and it came fast, and it told you everything about the pressure that had been building in communities who felt they had nothing and had briefly, for one night, believed they had something. The anger was not just at Pepsi. It was at every system that had ever told people like them that the rules applied differently depending on how much money you had. You do not throw a grenade at a truck over 500 pesos. You throw a grenade at a truck over the feeling that the world has, once again, looked you in the eye and told you that you do not count. Lives lost and the human cost. I have been obsessed with stories like this since I was a child. Not the disasters themselves, but the people in CDCmin, the names that get reduced to statistics in the official reports, but were, to someone somewhere, the entire world. The violence connected to the number fever aftermath killed people. The precise number is difficult to establish with certainty because the incidents were scattered across the country and documented unevenly. But several deaths and dozens of injuries are confirmed in contemporaneous reporting and court records. Among the dead was a woman killed in the grenade attack on a Pepsi truck in Manila. She was not a Pepsi employee. She was not involved in any dispute. She happened to be near the vehicle when the grenade was thrown. She died because a corporation made a printing error and then handled the fallout with the warmth of a legal department memo. I have never told anyone this, but the first time I read about her, I actually had to put my notes down and just sit with it for a minute. Because that is the thing about these stories. You can follow the chain of causation, the error, the announcement, the consolation offer, the fury. And at every step, you can identify the decision, or the failure, or the miscalculation that moved events forward. But at the end of that chain is a real person who simply happened to be in the wrong place, connected to all of it, and none of it, and they are gone. The human cost extended beyond the immediate violence. Families who had believed they had won and had made plans, spoken to relatives, perhaps even begun to spend the money in their imaginations, experienced a kind of financial grief that is hard to quantify, but very real. For communities where poverty was not an occasional difficulty but a permanent condition, the brief window of 1 million pesos and its abrupt closure was genuinely traumatic. Some accounts from the period describe people in shock, unable to fully process what had happened. And then there were the cap holders, who had accepted the 500 pesos consolation, who had quietly folded their disappointment away and moved on. And the ones who had not, who refused the offer and pursued Pepsi through the courts for years afterward. These are not statistics. These are real people who spent real time, real energy, and real hope on a legal system that would take years to give them answers. The legal avalanche. This is the part of the story I find most underrated. And I personally think most people who know about number fever do not fully appreciate how staggering the legal dimension of it was. The number of lawsuits filed against Pepsi in the aftermath of number fever has been reported at over 700,000 individual cases. To contextualize that, the entire Philippine court system processes something in the order of a few 100,000 cases per year or across all categories of litigation. 700,000 new lawsuits, most of them essentially identical in their claim, did not just strain the system, they threatened to break it entirely. Many of the cases were filed by individual cap holders, ordinary Filipinos who had paid for a bottle of Pepsi, found the number 349 printed inside, heard on television that they had won 1 million pesos, and then been told they had not. Their argument was, at its core, simple. Pepsi made a public announcement. I relied on that announcement. Pepsi should honor it. The counter-argument that the draw had been conducted in error and that 349 was a designated non-winning number was equally straightforward in legal terms, even if it felt unbearably cold in human terms. The Philippine courts, to their credit, took the cases seriously, and the rulings were, over time, genuinely mixed. Some lower courts found in favor of individual cap holders, ordering Pepsi to pay. Others sided with the company. The Supreme Court of the Philippines eventually became involved, and the high-profile legal proceedings dragged on for years. Pepsi did make significant consolation payments to large numbers of claimants over time, in some cases beyond the initial 500 peso offer, as part of negotiated settlements. But the full 1 million pesos per cap that so many had believed they were entitled to was never paid on a mass basis. The legal avalanche also served a secondary purpose, perhaps unintentionally. It kept number fever alive in the public consciousness for years after the initial eruption. Every court ruling, Every settlement announcement, every appeal was a reminder of the original event, the original broken promise, the original morning when hope was given and then taken away. Who was really to blame? I interviewed 7 different people with expertise in marketing, corporate law, and consumer protection about this story, and not a single one could agree on a clean answer to the question of blame. That alone tells you everything. The most obvious target is DG Consultories, the contractor who managed the draw. Whatever safeguard failed, it failed on their watch. Several civil and criminal complaints followed. Fair enough. The contractor was in the wrong. But that is only part of the story. But here is where I always push back. Pepsi chose that contractor. Pepsi designed a campaign with a theoretical liability in the hundreds of billions of pesos and handed its management entirely to a third party, with apparently no meaningful redundancy, no independent verification, no second set of eyes before a number went out to an entire nation. That is not a contractor problem. That is a structural failure of oversight, and it starts at the top. And then there is the campaign itself. Number Fever had catastrophic downside risk baked into its very design. That was the point. The possibility of enormous winnings for ordinary people was the engine that made it work. But it also created a psychological contract with Filipino consumers that, while not legally binding, was completely real in every human sense. When Pepsi broke it, the backlash was exactly proportional to the hope they had deliberately, strategically, and profitably created. This is a topic I avoided for a long time because the question of accountability genuinely makes me uncomfortable. The closer you look, the more the blame dissolves across multiple parties. And yet people died. That gap between what happened and what justice looks like is one I still have not resolved. What the world should have learned. The herald of free enterprise capsized because of warnings ignored. The More Campai Bay tragedy happened because workers were treated as a cost within a calculation. And Number Fever exploded because a corporation created hope as a commercial tool, failed to manage it with appropriate seriousness, and then was surprised when the people whose hope they had ignited and extinguished refused to simply walk away quietly. This is the kind of thing that, once you understand it, completely changes how you look at promotional campaigns, loyalty schemes, and the entire industry of manufacturing desire in ordinary people for commercial purposes. In the aftermath of Number Fever, the Philippines strengthened its regulations around promotional contests, imposing stricter requirements on companies running large-scale prize promotions, including mandatory escrow of prize funds and more rigorous oversight of draw mechanics. These were sensible changes, and they were direct responses to the specific failures that Number Fever exposed. But I personally think the deeper lesson, the one that is still not fully absorbed, is about the nature of the contract between corporations and consumers in poor communities. When you sell the dream of 1,000,000 pesos to a family who has never had 100,000 to their name, you are doing something that carries real moral weight. You are briefly rearranging their understanding of what their life could be. And if you then snatch that rearrangement away because of a technical error that was entirely your fault and your contractor's fault and nobody else's, the fact that you have a legal argument does not absolve you of the human consequence of what you did. Pepsi recovered in the Philippines eventually. Business continued. Bottles were sold. The company is still there today. But Number Fever is still remembered, still talked about, still taught in business schools as a case study in risk management and crisis communication. And in the neighborhoods where people checked their caps on the morning of May 26, 1992, and felt, just for a few hours, that everything was about to change, it has never quite been forgotten. There were no heroes in this story. Not really. There was no Andrew Parker lying himself across a gap so others could walk to safety. There was no rescue diver pulling a child from freezing water. Number Fever was not that kind of disaster. It was quieter, more diffuse. Its damage spread across hundreds of thousands of ordinary moments. A family at a kitchen table. a bottle cap in a palm, a number on a television screen. And then, the silence that comes after hope leaves. 30 years on, 349 is still in the Philippines, a number people remember. And I think that says everything about how powerful it is. You can rebrand a ferry company. You can drain a lake and reshape its bed. You can pass new safety laws and build new regulations. But you cannot give back the morning that was taken from the people who checked their caps and believed, just for a little while, that their number had come in. That is the cost of number fever, and it was paid entirely by the people who could least afford it. Naturally, this is a story with real human consequences, and our thoughts go out to everyone affected by the events of 1992. I hope you enjoyed the way the material was presented. I have loved sharing this one with you. It has been sitting with me for a long time, and it feels good to finally let it breathe. I'll see you on the next one, and I will bid you goodbye for now.